This morning's learning is sponsored by my parents to mark the yahrzeit of Rachel Leah Bas Rabbi Eliyahu Chaim. Leah Mann was my mother's mother. And if I could just say for a very, very brief moment, if one were to try to break down her life in one sentence, I think it would be, my mother was talking about this last night, I think it would be that she constantly strove for more, constantly pushed for more, never allowed obstacles to get in her way. And she was an extremely active and vibrant person to a very old age, really until it was just not physically possible for her anymore. And I think there's a lot for all of us to learn. And particularly in this time of year, I think it's a lot to learn from, because I think one of the greatest impediments to self-improvement is not believing that a person really can. And she was a tremendous model for all who had the opportunity to know her, that the greatest limit one could ever place on oneself is from oneself. The greatest limit one could ever have is from oneself. And she really modeled breaking down those limits, and her neshama shev and Aliyah. And thank you to my parents for sponsoring. Okay, we're going to begin with chapter 32, verse 6. Chapter 32, verse 6. Hal Hashem tigmaluzos. Will you do this to God? Am naval v'lo chacham. Naval is a very, very interesting word. We all know that context helps a lot in translating words. So whatever naval means, it's clearly not a positive adjective. That's very clear in the context of the pasuk, because the next phrase is you're not wise. So am naval is probably not a glowing compliment, but it is going to be worth it for us to try to understand what it does mean. Halahu avicha kanecha. He is your father who has acquired you. Huascha. He has made you. Vaychorenecha, and he has prepared you for that which you will do. Let's go to the Ramban on Pasuk Vav. Ramban on Pasuk Vav. Am naval v'lo chacham. So he starts off by citing Rashi. Shashachachu hatov she'asa lahem. That you, the Jewish people, have forgotten the good that God has done for them. V'lo chacham, and they haven't been wise. Lahavin es hanolad, to think about what the future might bring. Sheyesh biyado lehetiv ulahareya, that God always has the capacity to do good for us or do not as good for us. Lashon Rashi. So it's interesting. So he understands naval as being forgetting of good. You forget all the good that God has done for you. And it's really interesting. Lo chacham, it actually evokes memories of the famous Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, Ezu chacham haroes hanolad, who's a wise person, a person who sees what the results will be. So you're not being wise because not only are you not remembering God's goodness to you, but you're not being smart because who knows what God will do to you if you don't keep his commandments appropriately. That's how Rashi explains it. The Unclis Tirgame, the Unclis on the pasuk explains, Ama tekabilu oraisa. He says it refers to the nation that literally accepted the Torah, but the point here seems to be the nation that has rejected the Torah. Aso min navol tibo shapiresh bo milo sileh. You're sort of like not interested in the Torah anymore. Yisro says to Moshe, if you try to do all the judgments on your own, you'll waste away. You won't be able to handle it all. Navol tibol. So I'm naval. So it's like you're not engaging with the Torah anymore. That seems to be how the Unclis explains it. Yomar am shenilu ba'asiyas haTorah. The people that have sort of, in some sense, rejected the observance of the Torah. And you're not being wise, because would that you only understand that this is the best thing that you could do for yourselves, to be connected to the Torah. There's a pasuk that talks about a nation that's naval, and the Unclis translates it as a foolish nation. The context there is that they've refused to be people of wisdom. Rabbi Avraham Amar, Naval b'masev lo chacham b'leiv. It's very interesting. He says Naval means you're sort of disgusting in your actions, and you're not wise in your heart. In other words, am naval, you're acting in an inappropriate way, and you're not being wise. You're not being, sorry for the noise, you're not being thoughtful. You're not being thoughtful in your relationship to God. Ulefi dati, so those are three different pshatim, and now the Ramban says his own. Ulefi dati, I think the pshat is ha'osa tovas chinam yikare nadav. A person who does good for someone else without getting anything in return is called a person of generous spirit. Mushalim ra l'mishahetivimo yikare naval. And a person who responds with bad to someone who's done good for them is called a naval. V'husha amar lo yikare od naval nadiv ki yuhavcho. V'lekach amral naval hakarmeli kishmo kenhu. Naval shmo unvala imo. Ki David asa imo tova gedola v'shamar eskol shelo lo rasa sham l'tmul v'yot b'malacha v'yvazeh. So we have someone in the story of David HaMelech whose name was Naval, and the Medrash says that the name was appropriate for him because David had done kindnesses for him, and his response were unkind acts. So the Ramban says what it means to be Naval is to respond to good with bad. V'zeu tam hakasav b'chaverim shaliyov levilti asosi mochem nevala ki yohem melamdim schus amasa Hashem anichba vanora shu b'mishpat v'imyera lohem tiroya nevala v'yitachin sheyikra kain sheyikari kain bavur shu nofel m'bnei adam kasher yomar ka'ela novelas alea k'mo novelas alea. It could be the pshat in Naval is like when something falls from people. In any event, the Ramban goes on. Im kein yomar akasuv hazos tigmulos Hashem ala tovo shasi machem. So what the pasuk is saying is, will this be your response to God for all the goodnesses He did for you? Am naval. If you don't do the good things in life, you're being naval. Shumashalim ra tachas tova. That you're paying back the goodness of God with bad. V'lo chacham, and you're not being wise. Bodas kilanavsham. Gamlu haro azos lo lokel. It's not just you're not being good to God. God doesn't need your mitzvos. You're messing yourselves up by not doing the mitzvos. Kinyan shenemar im chatasa matifal bov rabu pshoecha matasalam tzadakta matitin lo mamiyat chayikach. What are you doing for God already if you do mitzvos? Halo akel hu avicha ki olitcha v'gadelcha. Continuing in the pasuk, He's your father. He brought you into this world. He raised you. V'hu kanecha, and He acquired you. Shasamcha kinyan, ki otziacha me'ayin v'yisayesh. He made you something. You were nothing, and He made you something. V'cho yesh lo kinyan. Okay, so the idea is just to sum up. Rashi's explaining it as a language of you forgot the good that God did for you, and you're not remembering, you're not chacham, you're not remembering the future of what happens if people do bad things. The Unklis says it's like a language of not accepting the Torah. The Abed Ezra says it's a language of naval is acting incorrectly, and lo chacham, not being wise, is thinking incorrectly or not being thoughtful or spiritual. The Ramban says am naval means you're being ungrateful to God. He's done all these great things for you. How are you responding to Him? V'lo chacham, and you're not being intelligent anyway, because if you were intelligent, you realize the greatest beneficiary of your good deeds is you, not God. And further, how could you not do God's will? Because He's done so much for you. He brought you into this world. He's your father. He acquired you, meaning He made you something. He made you and He prepared you. So these are different pshatim in Am Naval. I think particularly this idea of the Ramban is certainly an appropriate one to think about as we approach Yom Kippur. To just not only an issue about getting in the good book and not being in the bad book. That's of course very important, but just think of all the brachos God has brought me in my life, and I mean, He did all these things for me for a reason, because He wants me to accomplish things of meaning in this world. So I got to get my act together. Okay, I want to read the next pasuk, verse 7. Zechor Yemos Olam. Remember the days of the world. Binu Shno Stor Vador. Think about the years from generation to generation. Sha'alavicha v'yageidcha. Ask your father and he'll tell you. Zekeinecha v'yom v'vach. Ask your elders and they'll explain it to you. Okay, so this is like a statement. Think about how God has impacted the world in all kinds of ways and how important it is for you to perform his mitzvos. And that's what where the next pasuk can go. So really interesting Orach Chaim on this pasuk. If you look at the Orach Chaim on pasuk Zayin, Zechor Yemos Olam. Amar Dalet Chalukos Kneged Arba Dvarim She'amar pasuk Shof Mezeh. He actually says that there are 4 significant statements being made in verse 7, and that parallels the 4 significant statements being made in verse 6. And each statement in verse 7 matches up with a statement from the previous verse 6. Kereged Amro Halo Hu Avicha. We said in verse 6 that God is your father. Sharamas Bo Shua Bore. That alluded to the fact that God created the world. Amar Zechor Yemos Olam. So for that it says, remember the days of the world. What does that mean, the days of the world? Sheb Sheshis Mebrachis. The days of creation, the days that go back to the creation of the world. Sham Yimotze Ki Hayotze Hu Abore. If you look back at those days, it becomes very clear that God made the world. So remember your father. If you remember that he's your father, he created the world, that connects to remembering the history of the creation of the world. Ukeneged Amro Kanecha Sheramas Nitzias Mitzrayim. It said in verse 6 that God acquired us. What does that mean that he acquired us? The Orach Chaim says it means that he did such great things for us. Amar Binu Shno Stor Vador, like he took us out of Egypt. So for that, it says, remember back to the years from generation to generation. Reflect on all the national experiences through the generations. Jumping ahead, Ukeneged Omro Oscha Shutikun Elyon Shapirashnubo. Regarding the fact that he made us, the Orach Chaim says, you know what it means? He made us, he gave us a soul. Not just he gave us arms and legs, he gave us a soul. Amar Sha'ala Vicha V'Yageidcha, for that, to understand that not only did he give us, more than he gave us a soul, he placed his divine presence among us and he brought prophecy to us. So for that, it says, ask your fathers and they'll tell you. It doesn't mean your biological father. It means ask, like the Navi sometimes referred to as a father, the one who brings spirituality to the people, the word of God to the people. So think about the fact that God brought his presence in your midst. Ask the Navi, ask the prophet about that. He'll tell you. And that he prepared us. What did that mean that he prepared us? Shapirashnua al hachanos olam haba. The Orach Chaim says, you know what that means? That means they prepared us for the world to come. Amar Zekeinecha v'yom v'vach. For that it says, speak to your elders and they'll tell you. Perush hem chachma Yisrael. Those are the sages of Israel. Hamakirim ba'achanas hadavar va'musag l'olam haba. The sages of Israel appreciate the idea of preparing for the world to come. So God is our Father. That relates to remember the history of the world. God acquired us, to the history of the creation of the world. God acquired us. That relates to remembering what happened through the generations of the Jewish people. God made us. God brought his divine presence in for us. Ask your father. Ask the Navi about that. And he prepared you to be able to enter into the next world. Ask the elders about that, the pious of Israel who give you a perspective. So that's an interesting shot about how 7 interacts with 6. And we had some ideas about Naval. We had some ideas about Naval.